Welcome, dear listener, to a place where mysteries come alive. Here, we bring you timeless tales of clever detectives, hidden motives, and unexpected twists. Whether it's the daring charm of Tommy and Tuppence, or the keen intellect of Poirot, every story invites you to think, to feel, and to solve the case. Stay curious, and welcome to Guardian of the Night Stories. The afternoon light filtered through the Yorkshire moorlands with a peculiar stillness that suggested rain was imminent. Hercule Poirot stood upon the platform of Ashford Station with his customary precision, his patent leather shoes polished to such a degree that they reflected the grey October sky like mirrors. His moustache, that magnificent symmetrical creation that had graced the pages of criminal history, was waxed to perfection, each hair exactly where Monsieur Poirot intended it to be. Monsieur Hercule Poirot? A young man inquired hesitantly, approaching with the gait of one uncertain of his reception. Poirot turned with deliberate grace, his small dark eyes taking in every detail. The ill-fitting suit, the nervous fidgeting with a telegram in his pocket, the fine tremor in the fellow's hands despite the cool autumn air. "I am he," Poirot replied, his Belgian accent lending a musical quality to the English words. "And you are?" "Timothy Ashford, sir. My father, Sir Reginald Ashford, he sent me to collect you. We received your telegram confirming your arrival." Timothy glanced over his shoulder, as though even the mention of his father might summon some unseen wrath. "I must confess, I don't quite understand why father was so insistent upon your coming. Surely the local constabulary—" "But of course, the local constabulary," Poirot interrupted gently, collecting his single leather valise. "They are no doubt capable men. Yet your father, he thought otherwise, no? He thought to engage Hercule Poirot. That itself is most interesting." As they drove through the moorland in the Ashford motor car, Timothy attempted explanation. Whitmore Manor, the Ashford ancestral seat, overlooked a valley that had sheltered the same family for some 3 centuries. It was a place of tradition, of ordered routine, of the sort of English country gentility that Poirot had encountered countless times in his long career. Yet it was precisely such places, Poirot reflected, that often concealed the most exquisite darkness. "The matter concerns my Uncle Cornelius," Timothy said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He died last month. The doctor said it was his heart. Uncle Cornelius had a weak constitution, you understand. But father has always maintained that something was irregular about it. Irregular." Poirot's attention sharpened considerably. "The letter," Timothy said. "A week before he died, Uncle Cornelius received a letter, unsigned. He read it, went quite pale, and burned it immediately in the fireplace. He spoke to no one about its contents, but he was in a dreadful state of nerves all week. When they found him the following Tuesday morning, he was dead in his bed. The doctor, Dr. Hammond, a thoroughly decent fellow, said it was a seizure of the heart. But father believed the letter might have— that is, the shock of whatever was written." "Ah," said Poirot softly, "your father suspects murder by fright, by the administration of extreme emotional distress. A most imaginative theory. You think him mistaken? I think your father sufficiently alarmed to engage the services of Hercule Poirot. That is not the action of a man labouring under mere imaginative fancy. There is something more, n'est-ce pas?" Timothy's hands tightened upon the steering wheel. Beyond the motor car window, Whitmore Manor emerged through the gloom. A substantial Victorian Gothic structure that seemed to brood over the valley with an almost sentient malevolence. It was precisely the sort of house, Poirot mused, that one might expect to contain secrets layered like geological strata. each older and more sinister than the last. There was also the matter of the will, Timothy said as he brought the motor car to a halt beneath the manor's entrance. Uncle Cornelius had been quite wealthy, very wealthy indeed. We all assumed, that is, the family had always believed, that his fortune would be distributed among his nieces and nephews. But when the solicitors opened his will, it was discovered that he had made a new testament merely 3 days before his death. Everything, the entire estate of some £40,000, was left to the Ashford Home for Orphaned Children, a charity of which he had taken interest only recently. Poirot emerged from the motor car with studied deliberation, his eyes moving across the manor's facade, taking in the architecture, the positioning of windows, the peculiar cast of light against ancient stone. And when was this new will discovered? And by whom? Why, by father, and myself, and our solicitor, Monsieur Poirot. We opened it together on the day of the funeral. Convenient, said Poirot, not unkindly. And who inherits should this new will be deemed invalid? Timothy's face flushed. I suppose. Well, the eldest heir would be my Aunt Margot, Uncle Cornelius's sister. She lives here at the manor, but she's hardly in need of funds, I assure you. She's comfortably situated already. As they ascended the manor steps, Poirot made a small sound of gentle scepticism in his throat, the sort of sound that had preceded the unravelling of 100 carefully constructed deceptions. Young Monsieur Timothy, he said, you must understand that Hercule Poirot does not concern himself with theories. Hercule Poirot concerns himself with facts. Your father has summoned me here because he senses, however dimly, that murder has been committed. I shall ascertain whether he is correct, but I shall require your complete honesty regarding all matters, no matter how trivial they may seem, no? Of course, sir, naturally. Naturally, Poirot echoed, though his tone suggested considerable doubt about the matter. Sir, Reginald Ashford was a man of 70 years, who had learned to compensate for the diminishment of his physical capacities with an increasingly impressive display of authority. His study was panelled in dark oak, lined with leather-bound volumes that appeared never to have been opened, and dominated by a formidable mahogany desk. Behind this desk, Sir Reginald sat regarding Poirot with the calculation of a man who had just paid an extraordinary sum and intended to receive commensurate value. I am relieved you've come, Sir Reginald began without preamble. The local inspector is a decent enough fellow, but he lacks imagination. When he declared Cornelius's death an outcome of natural causes, I attempted to persuade him otherwise. He seemed to believe I was merely a grieving brother distressed by loss. And were you? Poirot asked delicately, seating himself in the chair positioned before the desk. Distressed by your brother's loss? Sir Reginald's mouth compressed. That is rather beside the point, Monsieur Poirot. What matters is that Cornelius changed his will 3 days before his death, leaving everything to a charity. 3 days! And only after receiving a letter that so disturbed him, he burned it without discussion. The letter, said Poirot, has been destroyed entirely. I'm afraid so. Cornelius was quite thorough in his destruction of it. How convenient, said Poirot. And yet you speak of it with certainty. You witnessed its destruction? No, but then you are inferring. From what evidence? Sir Reginald appeared momentarily discomfited. From ash in the fireplace, from his behaviour, from... Ash is ash, Sir Reginald. It demonstrates nothing. But your brother's behaviour, that is most instructive. Tell me, those days between the letter's arrival and his death, how was your brother's demeanour? What precisely did you observe? Over the next hour, Poirot extracted from Sir Reginald a series of observations that, individually, seemed mundane, but collectively painted a portrait of a man gripped by internal conflict. Cornelius had eaten little. He had spent long hours in his room. He had seemed distracted during dinner, given to staring out windows. On the day before his death, he had visited the solicitors, an appointment made hastily according to the servants. "And his health prior to this crisis?" Poirot inquired. "Your brother suffered from cardiac weakness, I am told. For years. Nothing serious, merely a matter requiring a certain regimen. His physician, Dr. Hammond, had prescribed various tonics and recommended that he restrict his exertions." "And on the night of his death, did he demonstrate any physical distress? Any symptoms?" "He retired at his customary hour, according to the servants. The chambermaid brought him his evening water. By morning he was deceased." Poirot rose and requested to see the room wherein Cornelius had passed his final night. Sir Reginald conducted him personally through corridors lit by gaslight, past oil paintings of ancestral Ashfords, whose eyes seemed to track the little Belgian's progress, with mixture of amusement and apprehension. The death room was orderly, austere in its furnishings, a narrow bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk. Upon examination, Poirot found little of consequence. A book on agricultural reform, half read, a lamp with a faintly marked wick, and upon the bedside table traces of residue in a small glass. The evening water. Poirot held the glass up to the light. "I expect so, yes. The servants would have removed the fresh glass this morning when they found him." Poirot lifted the glass to his nose and inhaled delicately. His expression did not alter, but his eyes grew infinitesimally more brilliant. "Your brother took laudanum, perhaps, or another tonic prescribed by his physician. Dr. Hammond may have recommended such things. The servants would have knowledge of his medications." "The servants," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Let us speak with them, shall we?" Over the course of the afternoon, Poirot interviewed the household staff with the systematic precision of a man cataloguing items in a museum. The chambermaid, Miss Portman, was a girl of perhaps 22, nervous but forthcoming. She had brought Mr. Cornelius his evening water at 8:30, as was customary. He had seemed quiet-like, not himself. The butler, Masters, a man of 40 years' service, had observed that Mr. Cornelius had received a visitor on the day of the letter's arrival. A woman, though she had not given her name. The cook had noted that Mr. Cornelius had refused meals with increasing frequency, and the gardener's boy had seen Mr. Cornelius in the library late on the night before his death, looking at something in a book with a face like death itself. "Begging your pardon, sir." By evening, Poirot had formed a preliminary framework of understanding, though it remained skeletal, requiring flesh to transform it into coherent form. He requested paper and pen, and spent an hour reviewing his notes, occasionally pausing to consult a small leather-bound notebook that had accompanied him from London. At dinner, he was introduced to the remaining members of the household. Aunt Margot, as Timothy had referred to her, was a woman of 65 years, with the bearing of one accustomed to authority. She had managed Whitmore Manor for the decade since Sir Reginald's wife had died, and she clearly took considerable pride in the institution's operation. Her grey eyes were sharp, her conversation measured, her interest in Poirot's presence markedly reserved. "I trust my brother-in-law has not been troubling you with his peculiar theories about dear Cornelius," she said, her tone suggesting that she considered such theories beneath serious consideration. "Cornelius had a weak heart. That is fact. That he received distressing correspondence is perhaps true, but grief and anxiety can exacerbate existing conditions. It is hardly evidence of villainy." "And yet," said Poirot mildly, Your brother-in-law deemed it sufficiently serious to engage my services. That itself suggests something more profound than mere cardiac weakness, would you not agree? Aunt Margot's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Reginald has always been inclined toward the dramatic, Monsieur Poirot. It is family tendency, I suppose. Our father before him had a similar inclination toward theatrical interpretation of mundane events. The new will, said Poirot, delicately applying butter to a slice of bread. That is dramatic, certainly. Your brother changed his entire fortune's disposition merely days before his death. You must forgive me if I find that merely mundane. Cornelius became increasingly religious in his final years, Aunt Margot replied coolly. He took great interest in charitable works. The orphanage held particular appeal for him. It was natural that his interests would be reflected in his testament. Natural, Poirot echoed. How very orderly of him. And yet, such decisions, the redistribution of £40,000, these are not made in moments of sudden piety, are they? These are decisions that require contemplation, planning. Certainly, they are not made in response to a distressing letter received only days prior. You presume much based on limited information, Monsieur Poirot. Indeed, I presume nothing. I have observed that you are uncomfortable with this conversation. I have observed that you were fond of your brother, and yet not so fond that you have expressed grief at his passing. I have observed that you know considerably more regarding the circumstances of his death than you have thus far revealed. But I do not presume to know what that knowledge entails. That requires further investigation. Aunt Margot set down her cutlery with deliberate precision. I believe you will find, Monsieur Poirot, that not everything in this world requires investigation. Some matters are best left undisturbed. That, said Poirot pleasantly, is precisely what a guilty person would say. The remainder of the dinner proceeded in tense silence, punctuated only by the neutral observations of Sir Reginald and Timothy's increasingly desperate efforts to direct conversation towards safe topics. The following morning, Poirot requested the opportunity to examine Cornelius's personal effects. These had been collected into a small room adjoining his chamber. Books, correspondence, a collection of items that comprised the material artifact of a human life. Poirot proceeded methodically, his small eyes missing nothing, his fingers moving across surfaces with the delicate precision of a surgeon. The correspondence was largely unremarkable. Bills, invitations to charitable events, letters from various solicitors regarding his estate. But Poirot noted certain absences. There was no correspondence from Aunt Margot, despite her living in the same house. There were no letters from other family members beyond the occasional note from Sir Reginald regarding estate matters. The philanthropic correspondence, however, was extensive. Letters from the Ashford Home for Orphaned Children expressing gratitude for his donations, inviting him to serve on the board of directors, thanking him for his generosity of spirit. One letter in particular caught Poirot's attention. It bore no return address, and the handwriting was carefully disguised in the heavy block capitals of a child attempting to mimic adult penmanship. The letter read simply, "You know what you have done. You know the price to be paid. The debt will be collected. On the morning of the 8th, you will understand that vengeance is patient, but inexorable." The date inscribed upon the letter was 17 days prior to Cornelius's death, and the date mentioned, the morning of the 8th, corresponded precisely with the morning upon which Cornelius had been discovered deceased. Poirot folded the letter with deliberate care and placed it within his jacket pocket. He then turned to examine the books, most of which were volumes of religious instruction or philosophical meditation. All the standard works, Marcus Aurelius, Thomas à Kempis, contemporary sermons. Yet between 2 volumes on Eastern spirituality, Poirot discovered a small leather journal, its pages filled with Cornelius's own handwriting. The entries were sporadic but illuminating. June 15th. She came to me today. After all these years, I scarce recognized her, yet my heart knew her instantly. How is one to bear such revelation? How can one live with the knowledge of such profound wrong? July 2nd. I have attempted to make restitution. But how can mere money compensate for a life destroyed? She refuses to speak to me, and I confess I deserve her silence. What was I thinking? We were young, but youth is no excuse for cruelty. August 19th. The letter arrived today. I knew it would come eventually. I've spent these months in dread, and now that the reckoning approaches, I find I am almost relieved. Whatever comes, it is deserved. September 1st. She demands I change my will, that I leave everything to the orphanage. She says it is the only way to atone. Perhaps she is right. What use is this money to me? What good has it ever done, except to purchase my comfort and my silence? The most recent entry, dated 3 days before Cornelius's death, read simply, "Tomorrow I shall go to the solicitors. By week's end it shall be done. By week's end I shall be at peace, one way or another." Poirot set down the journal and stood motionless for some minutes, his fingers pressed together in that characteristic gesture of contemplation. Before him lay the outline of a story, incomplete, fragmentary, yet suggestive. A woman from the past, a wrong committed, a debt unpaid, a final reckoning. He descended to the library, where he requested of Sir Reginald the household records from the past 30 years. With the aid of a sympathetic Aunt Margot, for she seemed to recognize that resistance was now futile, he examined employment records and household accounts. It was in a document dated approximately 27 years prior that he found what he sought. The record of a housemaid, Sarah Blackwell, employed for the period of 6 months during the summer of 1873, with a notation beside her name indicating dismissed without reference moral impropriety. Sarah Blackwell, Poirot murmured, consulting his notebook. A name from the past. Tell me, Sir Reginald, do you recall this young woman? Sir Reginald's face underwent a subtle alteration. A tightening about the eyes. A barely perceptible shift in the set of his mouth. That would have been long ago, Monsieur Poirot. I confess I do not recall the specific individual. Yet she was dismissed for moral impropriety. That is rather severe a designation, is it not? More severe than would typically be applied to a simple housemaid who had committed some minor transgression. "Reginald," said Aunt Margot quietly, "you must tell him. There is no purpose in maintaining silence now." Sir Reginald closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his expression had shifted from defensive to something approaching resigned. It was a matter of considerable embarrassment to the family. Sarah Blackwell was. She and Cornelius. In his youth, Cornelius was not always as austere as you see him now. There was an involvement of an illicit nature. When it became apparent that the girl was to bear a child, father insisted upon her dismissal and departure from the county. Cornelius was persuaded to make a modest settlement, and the matter was considered concluded. But the child? Poirot's voice remained calm, professional, yet beneath the surface ran currents of profound sympathy for the woman whose life had been destroyed by circumstances beyond her control. What became of the child? "I do not know precisely," said Sir Reginald. "The girl disappeared. We assumed she found work elsewhere, married perhaps, made some life for herself. The matter was never discussed further." "And Cornelius," said Poirot softly. He carried this secret and this guilt for nearly 30 years, until the woman returned and demanded that he acknowledge his sin, that he repair, as best such things may be repaired, the damage done. That afternoon, Poirot dispatched a telegram to London. His investigation had revealed the structure of the mystery, but it remained a skeleton awaiting flesh. By evening, a response arrived via telephone. The Ashford Home for Orphan Children had indeed received a visit from a woman identifying herself as Sarah Blackwell some 2 months prior. She had inquired regarding the possibility of employment, and though none was available, the director had noted her interest in philanthropic works. Her address had been recorded as a small cottage on the outskirts of Ashford Village, at number 7, Moorland Lane. Poirot requested that Timothy drive him into the village that evening. The cottage was small, neat, and possessed that particular air of genteel poverty that suggested its occupant had fallen from better circumstances, but maintained with determined dignity whatever reduced station they now inhabited. A woman answered the door, a woman of perhaps 55 years, with traces of past beauty still visible beneath the weathering of time and hardship. Her eyes widened when she perceived Poirot. "You are the detective," she said. "It was not a question. Hercule Poirot at your service, madam. And you are Sarah Blackwell, or Sarah Thornton, as I have been for many years now. My late husband's name. Won't you come in?" She showed them into a small but immaculate parlour. Upon the mantelpiece stood a single photograph. A girl of perhaps 20 years, with Cornelius's eyes and Sarah's darker hair. The resemblance was unmistakable. "She is deceased now," Sarah said, noting Poirot's attention. "Eleanor died of consumption 5 years ago when she was 27 years old. She never knew her father, never knew who he was, but she knew that she had been born out of wedlock, born of shame, born into a life of struggle and humiliation, because a young man of the gentry had taken his pleasure with a housemaid and then cast her aside. And when Cornelius discovered that Eleanor had died, I wrote to him," Sarah interrupted. 2 years ago, I wrote to him explaining who Eleanor had been, informing him that his daughter had existed and perished in poverty while he lived in luxury and comfort. I told him that I was old now, that I had long ago forgiven him his youth and his cruelty, but that I wished him to know the consequences of his actions. I wished him to understand that there were people in this world who had suffered because of what he had done. And his response? Poirot moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening moorland. "Delayed," said Sarah. "But then, about 4 months ago, I received a visit from him. He was devastated. To have fathered a daughter, only to discover she had lived and died without his knowledge or assistance, it broke him. He asked how he might make amends. I told him that amends could not be made, that Eleanor was beyond the reach of any compensation, but that he might at least do some good in this world with his fortune. He might help children like Eleanor had been, orphaned, dispossessed, vulnerable. And so he changed his will," said Poirot. 3 days later, yes, I believe he intended to do more as well. To establish a scholarship fund for orphaned girls, to serve on the home's board of directors personally. He was planning to come to Ashford and make a public announcement of his charitable intentions. But he died, said Poirot, before those plans could be executed. Sarah's face crumpled slightly. Yes, I received the news in the local paper. At first, I thought it was merely God's timing, that perhaps it was meant to be. But then I received a letter, an unsigned letter. It said that I was to tell no one of Cornelius's true purpose in changing his will, that if I did so, there would be consequences not only for myself, but for the orphans he had sought to help. Someone threatened to ensure that his charitable intentions would be frustrated, that the Ashford home would never receive his bequest. "And you complied," said Poirot. "You maintained silence. I was frightened. I am old, Monsieur Poirot. I have little left in this world except my reputation and the memory of my daughter. I could not bear to see her memory dragged through scandal again. So yes, I remained silent. The letter," said Poirot urgently. "Do you still possess it?" Sarah retrieved a worn envelope from a small box on the mantelpiece. The handwriting was the same as the letter Poirot had discovered in Cornelius's room. The careful block capitals of someone attempting to disguise their natural handwriting. But now Poirot realized it was not the handwriting of a child playing at deception. It was the handwriting of someone attempting to appear as a child might write, which suggested an entirely different perpetrator. "Madame," said Poirot, his voice grave, "I must now ask you a question of great importance, and I require your absolute honesty. Do you believe that Cornelius died of natural causes, or do you believe he was murdered?" Sarah looked away toward the photograph of Eleanor. "I have thought of little else since I learned of his death. I came to the village hoping to learn more, hoping to understand. I attended the funeral from a distance, hidden in the churchyard shadows. I saw his coffin lowered into the earth, and I wondered, if he had lived, if he had fulfilled his intentions, might Eleanor's memory have been honored? Might her suffering have had some meaning? But that is not an answer to my question," said Poirot gently. "No," said Sarah at last. "It is not. The answer is yes, Monsieur Poirot. I believe he was murdered, and I believe that whoever murdered him did so to prevent his charitable intentions from being realized. The letter was a threat, yes, but also a confession of sorts. Whoever wrote that letter knew that Cornelius intended to change his will, and whoever wrote that letter wanted to ensure that he never lived to publicly justify his actions." Over the following days, Poirot's investigation began to assume the contours of a case study in concealment and misdirection. He interviewed village physicians, solicitors, and tradespeople. He examined records of recent visitors to the manor. He consulted the household accounts with the meticulous attention of an auditor seeking evidence of embezzlement. And gradually, a pattern began to emerge. Subtle, almost invisible unless one possessed Poirot's particular gift for perceiving the interconnections between seemingly disparate facts. The letter to Cornelius, the one employing disguised handwriting and cryptic threats, bore traces of erasure and revision. Someone had written it hastily, then reconsidered, then rewritten portions. The quality of the paper suggested it had been composed on the manor premises, as only the estate stocked such particular stock. The ink utilized was not the standard blue-black employed by commercial establishments, but rather a particular shade of brown that Poirot traced to a bottle in the manor's library, a bottle positioned upon a desk, used primarily for administrative correspondence. His inquiries regarding the mysterious female visitor on the day of the letter's arrival proved enlightening. The butler, Masters, was able to provide a description. A woman of middle years, dressed in fashionable attire, arriving in a motor car driven by an unknown male. She had remained for nearly 2 hours and had departed in considerable agitation. Her features, Masters recalled, bore a certain resemblance to members of the Ashford family, though he could not specify which member precisely. "Perhaps," suggested Poirot to Timothy, "you might consult the household employment register. Perhaps there is a cousin or distant relation visiting from town." But there was not. The register revealed no external visitors of the female persuasion during the period in question. It was in examining the physician's records that Poirot made a most illuminating discovery. Dr. Hammond had indeed prescribed various tonics to Cornelius, a standard preparation for cardiac weakness, with certain stimulating properties. However, the quantities prescribed were considerably less than those that had been dispensed. The apothecary's records indicated that additional quantities had been requested on multiple occasions, always by personal messenger rather than by Cornelius himself. "Tell me," Poirot asked of the apothecary, a cautious man named Mr. Griggs, who brought these requests for additional tonic. Mr. Griggs consulted his records with the meticulous attention of one accustomed to legal scrutiny. "The requests were all signed, Monsieur Poirot, signed in Dr. Hammond's own hand. I should not have dispensed them otherwise." "And yet, did you deliver them personally to Dr. Hammond?" "No, sir. They were collected by Miss Portman, the chambermaid at the manor. She came in perhaps 4 times over the space of 3 weeks, each time with a request for additional supply. She explained that Mr. Cornelius's condition had taken a turn for the worse, and that Dr. Hammond had deemed it necessary to increase the dosage." That evening, Poirot requested a private conversation with Miss Portman. The chambermaid was a nervous young woman, prone to anxiety, but her account was straightforward. Yes, she had collected the additional tonics. Yes, she had believed them to be prescribed by Dr. Hammond. No, she had not thought anything unusual about the requests, as Mr. Cornelius had indeed seemed increasingly unwell. "And who instructed you to collect these tonics?" Poirot asked gently. "Who gave you the notes signed by the doctor?" Miss Portman's hands trembled. I was asked not to speak of it." "By whom?" "By Aunt Margot. She said that Mr. Cornelius's condition was delicate, that increased medication might be necessary, but that such matters were private, and not to be discussed. She gave me the notes and the money to pay for the tonics." "I see," said Poirot softly. "And Aunt Margot seemed anxious about these matters?" "No, sir. She was quite composed. She seemed to be managing his care very carefully. She checked on him regularly, more regularly than she used to. She even oversaw his bedtime routine those final weeks, ensuring he took his evening water and his tonic without delay." That evening, Poirot sat alone in his guest chamber, his fingers pressed together, his mind traversing the pathways of logic and deduction. The pattern was becoming clear, murky yet discernible, but there remained gaps, inconsistencies, aspects that did not align precisely with the framework he had constructed. He requested a meeting with Dr. Hammond, who arrived at the manor the following afternoon, a man of professional bearing and obvious anxiety. When Poirot presented the evidence regarding the forged prescriptions, Dr. Hammond's initial defensiveness gave way to shocked comprehension. "I signed no such notes," he insisted. "These are forgeries. Skillful ones, I confess, but forgeries nonetheless. Whoever composed them knew my hand sufficiently well to create a convincing facsimile." "And who among your acquaintances possesses such knowledge?" Poirot inquired. I have no idea. My handwriting is not particularly distinctive. Anyone who had received correspondence from me. But more significantly, Poirot continued, anyone who regularly resided within my household, or who observed me writing professional correspondence. Tell me, Doctor, does Miss Portman's description of the additional tonics accord with your knowledge of Mr. Cornelius's condition? Not precisely. His cardiac weakness was chronic but stable. There was no indication that his condition had deteriorated significantly. Any increase in medication would have been unwarranted and potentially dangerous. Dangerous in what manner? The tonics I prescribed were stimulating in nature, designed to strengthen the heart's action. An excessive dosage might induce palpitations, arrhythmia. In a man with a pre-existing cardiac condition, such symptoms might precipitate a serious episode. A fatal episode. Dr. Hammond looked away. It is possible. If the dosage were sufficiently excessive, and if the patient were subjected simultaneously to emotional distress, to distress provoked, perhaps, by an unsigned letter threatening him with vengeance. Yes, in combination such factors might indeed prove fatal. Poirot descended from his chamber that evening with the clear intention of confronting Aunt Margot. But as he reached the corridor leading to the main staircase, he heard a disturbance from below. Raised voices, the sound of furniture overturned, a cry of pain. He descended rapidly to discover chaos in the library. Sir Reginald lay upon the floor, bleeding from a wound to his temple. His face was pale, his breathing laboured. Timothy knelt beside him, his face ashen, and Aunt Margot stood near the window, her hand trembling, her eyes wide. "He fell," she said immediately. "Sir Reginald seemed unwell, and when I entered the room he was collapsing. I attempted to catch him, but his weight was too great." But Poirot observed that the library door had been locked from within. He observed that there was a faint smell of laudanum in the air, the same peculiar scent that had emanated from the glass in Cornelius's chamber, and he observed that upon Sir Reginald's lips were traces of a viscous liquid, identical in appearance to the tonic that had been administered to Cornelius. "Aunt Margot," said Poirot quietly, "you have attempted murder a second time, and in doing so, you have confirmed the true nature of Cornelius's death." The manor erupted into chaos. The servants were summoned. Constables arrived from Ashford village. Sir Reginald was conveyed to the hospital in town, where the physicians confirmed that he had been administered a massive overdose of the cardiac stimulant, precisely the same overdose that had been given to Cornelius. But the most damning evidence came not from the tonics or the forged prescriptions, but from a small red leather journal, discovered hidden within a loose stone behind the library fireplace. It was Aunt Margot's own account of her crimes, written in the manner of a confession. "I have discovered that Cornelius intends to reveal our family's shame, to publicly acknowledge his bastard daughter, and to fund her orphanage. The scandal will be unbearable. The name of Ashford, which father spent a lifetime building and maintaining, will become synonymous with impropriety and dishonor. I cannot permit this. I have administered increasingly large doses of the cardiac stimulant under the guise of prescribed treatment. I have forged Dr. Hammond's hand sufficiently to satisfy the apothecary. I have timed the letter to arrive at such a moment as would induce maximum emotional disturbance. Within a fortnight, Cornelius shall be deceased, having expired of a natural cardiac failure. The new will shall be discovered, revealing his delusional generosity. I shall ensure that the scandal is suppressed, that the true nature of his final intentions never becomes public. The Ashford name shall be preserved." As Aunt Margot was led away by the constables, Poirot seated himself in Sir Reginald's study, awaiting the arrival of Inspector Blackwood, the regional detective who had been summoned from London. The evidence was now unambiguous. A confession in Aunt Margot's own handwriting, the testimony of multiple witnesses, the physical evidence of tampering with medications. And yet, Poirot found himself troubled. The second attempt on Sir Reginald's life seemed inconsistent with Aunt Margot's carefully calculated approach to Cornelius's murder. That crime had been executed with meticulous precision, spread across weeks, involving forged documents, careful administration of increasing doses. But the attack upon Sir Reginald had been precipitous, crude, and, most significantly, unsuccessful. When Inspector Blackwood arrived, a competent-appearing man of perhaps 40 years, Poirot presented the evidence in his methodical fashion. The inspector seemed satisfied that the case had been resolved, that Aunt Margot's guilt was established beyond reasonable doubt. and that the matter might be considered concluded. But I wonder, said Poirot gently, if you might indulge me in a small matter of clarification. The letter received by Cornelius, the one containing the threat regarding vengeance, on the morning of the 8th, this letter was composed in disguised handwriting, was it not? Yes, said Inspector Blackwood. We have concluded that the disguise was intended to confound investigators, and that Aunt Margot was responsible for its composition. And yet, Poirot continued, retrieving both letters, the one addressed to Cornelius and the one sent to Sarah Blackwell, and placing them side by side. Examine the handwriting in these two documents with particular attention. The letter to Cornelius employs block capitals in a childish hand, deliberately awkward, but the letter to Sarah Blackwell, though also employing block capitals, demonstrates a distinctly different quality. The capitals in the second letter possess a particular flourish, a more mature execution. Why would Aunt Margot employ such divergent disguises for communications sent in the same time period for the same purpose? Inspector Blackwood examined the documents with the careful attention of one whose confidence was beginning to waver. You suggest that the letters were composed by different individuals. I suggest that the evidence indicates precisely such a conclusion. Moreover, examine the paper utilized. The letter to Cornelius is composed upon manor stationery. This has been confirmed through comparison with other documents. But the letter to Sarah Blackwell is composed upon paper of a distinctly different quality, with a watermark indicating German manufacture. German paper, Inspector. Most unusual for a crime committed in Yorkshire. You believe there are two murderers? Inspector Blackwood's voice betrayed considerable skepticism. I believe, said Poirot, that we have thus far identified only one, and I fear that the second may yet pose a threat far more formidable than Aunt Margot, whose guilt, while undeniable regarding Cornelius, may prove to be incomplete regarding the wider conspiracy. As if in response to this utterance, a telegram arrived from the hospital in town. Sir Reginald's condition, which had seemed to stabilize, had taken an unexpected turn for the worse. Despite the physician's best efforts, he had lapsed into unconsciousness and seemed unlikely to survive the night. Poirot rose with sudden urgency. "The hospital," he said to Timothy. "We must proceed there immediately." The drive to the hospital proceeded in tense silence, the motor car racing through the darkening moorland. When they arrived, they discovered Dr. Hammond in a state of considerable agitation, standing outside Sir Reginald's private room. The physicians were at a loss. Despite having attempted the administration of stimulants and various restorative measures, Sir Reginald's consciousness showed no sign of returning. His pulse had grown increasingly erratic, and death seemed merely a matter of hours away. "There is something else," Dr. Hammond informed Poirot with obvious distress. "A nurse brought Sir Reginald an evening medication, supposedly prescribed by his attending physician. When I examined the substance, I recognized it as a known poison, one that would induce symptoms precisely consistent with his current condition. The dosage was sufficient to be fatal." "And who delivered this medication?" Poirot's voice was sharp as a blade. "A nurse, a woman who had been hired only 2 days prior, supposedly through the agency. When we investigated, we discovered that no such woman had been hired through any legitimate agency. She appeared, administered the poison, and then vanished before the crime could be detected." Poirot entered Sir Reginald's chamber and stood motionless beside the unconscious man's bed. In his mind, the pattern was crystallizing with terrible clarity. A second murderer. Someone more sophisticated, more ruthless, and more determined than Aunt Margot. Someone whose motives remained yet unplumbed, whose connection to the original crime was obscured. "Tell me," Poirot said, returning to the corridor where the hospital staff had assembled. "Did any of you observe distinctive characteristics of this nurse? Any details that might aid in her identification?" A young orderly stepped forward hesitantly. "She had a peculiar accent, sir. Not quite English. German, perhaps, or Austrian," said Poirot with certainty. "And her age? Her appearance? Perhaps 40 years, sir. Dark hair, quite handsome in a severe sort of way. She seemed very familiar with medical procedures. That is why no one questioned her authority when she brought the medication." Poirot excused himself and placed an urgent telephone call to his contacts in London. The description matched only one individual within the reaches of criminal knowledge that Poirot maintained. A woman known variously as Countess Margot von Hellstein, or by several other aliases, a Viennese socialite who had been involved in a series of murders across the continent, each perpetrated in such a manner as to appear natural or accidental. She was believed to be motivated by revenge, by a personal vendetta against particular families of the English aristocracy, though the precise nature of her grudge remained obscure. And yet, how had she become connected to the Ashford case? How had her path intersected with Aunt Margot's conspiracy? What motivated her to ensure that Sir Reginald would die on the very night of Aunt Margot's arrest? The answer, Poirot realized with growing horror, was that Aunt Margot was not merely the perpetrator she had seemed, but rather a pawn in a far more complex game. The real architect of this tragedy was the Viennese woman, the Countess who had, through careful manipulation, induced Aunt Margot to commit murder, only to then ensure that the evidence pointed so clearly toward Aunt Margot that her own involvement would remain forever concealed. Poirot found Timothy in the hospital's waiting room, his face pale with shock and grief. "Your father will not survive the night," Poirot said without preamble. "And before he dies, we must ensure that he records his account of events with absolute clarity. There is another element to this mystery, young Monsieur Timothy, and it is that element which has just attempted to silence your father permanently." Over the course of the evening, Sir Reginald regained consciousness briefly. His words were slurred and difficult, but Poirot listened with meticulous attention. With effort born of desperation, Sir Reginald managed to speak of a woman who had visited him in recent months, a woman who had known intimate details of the Ashford family history, who had seemed particularly interested in Cornelius's whereabouts and activities. She said she was a cousin from Vienna. Sir Reginald gasped. "She seemed so charming, so interested in our family history. I mentioned that Cornelius had behaved oddly, that I suspected. I told her everything. She seemed sympathetic, understanding. And then she said that perhaps Cornelius needed to be removed, that his indiscretions would ruin the family name." "And you believed her capable of arranging such removal?" Poirot asked gently. I was distressed, uncertain. I confess I did not imagine she would act upon the conversation. But then Cornelius died, and I realized what I had done, what I had permitted. I attempted to investigate, to confirm that my worst fears were justified. And then Sir Reginald's voice faded, and despite the physician's best efforts, consciousness did not return. By dawn, he had expired. The body of Sir Reginald Ashford was discovered to contain traces of poison so subtle, so carefully calibrated, that it had been entirely impossible to detect while he lived. The physicians determined that his death had resulted from the cumulative effects of the original overdose of cardiac stimulant combined with the later poisoning. A combination so lethal, so precisely calculated, that it demonstrated the work of a master criminal. In the aftermath of Sir Reginald's death, Poirot withdrew to his guest chamber at Whitmore Manor, requesting that he not be disturbed for 6 hours. During this interval, he neither ate nor slept, but instead sat motionless in a leather chair, his eyes closed, his fingers pressed together in that characteristic attitude of profound concentration. Around him, the manor existed in a state of controlled chaos. Servants went about their duties with diminished efficiency. Timothy occupied himself with funeral arrangements and legal consultations. The constables conducted their interviews and recorded their evidence. And in the local jail, Aunt Margot awaited trial, her guilt seemingly unambiguous, and her fate apparently sealed. But Poirot knew otherwise. His understanding of the case had undergone a complete transformation during those 6 hours of meditation. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward crime, a murder motivated by family shame and inheritance, had revealed itself to be something far more sinister. A woman of considerable intelligence and ruthlessness had systematically orchestrated not merely Cornelius's death, but the destruction of the entire Ashford lineage's reputation and power. When Poirot at last emerged from his chamber, he sent for Inspector Blackwood, requesting a thorough investigation into the Vienna connection. The inspector, though initially skeptical, proved amenable to the suggestion when Poirot explained the technical impossibilities inherent in the current theory. "You must understand, Inspector," said Poirot, "that Aunt Margot possessed no knowledge of poisons, no medical training sufficient to administer a dose calibrated to produce precisely the symptoms observed in Sir Reginald's final illness. Nor would she have possessed the connections necessary to engage a foreign nurse on such brief notice. The only logical conclusion is that she was manipulated by a more sophisticated criminal intelligence. But how could such manipulation have been accomplished?" Inspector Blackwood seemed genuinely puzzled. "Through the exploitation of family shame," Poirot explained. "The Viennese woman, this Countess von Hellstein, or whatever name she currently employs, possessed detailed knowledge of the Ashford family scandals. She visited Sir Reginald and suggested to him that Cornelius's indiscretions might require more decisive action than mere exposure. She then visited Aunt Margot, I suspect under a different name, representing herself as some manner of family, relation or confidant, and manipulated her into believing that Cornelius's death would be a necessary step to preserve family honor. But what was the Countess's motive? Inspector Blackwood struggled to comprehend. Why undertake such an elaborate revenge against people who presumably had never wronged her? "That," said Poirot, "is the aspect of this case that requires illumination. It is the one element that does not, as yet, fit neatly into the framework of logic. The Countess had clearly planned this revenge with meticulous precision. Planned it across years, not weeks. She had cultivated relationships, studied family histories, positioned herself to strike at precisely the moment when maximum damage could be achieved." That afternoon, Poirot requested access to a comprehensive directory of European aristocracy. His inquiry was directed specifically to families named Hellstein, families with connections to Vienna, families who might possess grievances against the Ashford lineage. It was in an old volume, published some 40 years prior, that Poirot discovered the crucial entry. A Baron Friedrich Hellstein, deceased in 1884, had been engaged to marry Miss Lucinda Ashford, Sir Reginald's younger sister, in what was to have been a politically advantageous union between prominent English and Austro-Hungarian families. The engagement had been terminated under circumstances deemed scandalous and tragic, with Miss Lucinda subsequently marrying a country solicitor and living in obscurity until her death in 1902. No further details were provided in the directory, but the basic facts were sufficient to suggest a narrative of shame and betrayal. Poirot telegraphed his London contacts once more, requesting any available information regarding the Helstein family's descent and current composition. By evening, a response arrived indicating that Baron Helstein had possessed a single surviving daughter, Margot, born to his mistress some years after his cancelled English engagement, who had adopted his name despite her illegitimate birth and had subsequently developed a reputation as a society woman of questionable character and mysterious motivations. The connection is now evident, Poirot explained to Inspector Blackwood. Margot Helstein, or the Countess as she prefers to style herself, is the illegitimate daughter of the Baron, whose engagement was terminated by the Ashford family. She was born of shame, raised in relative obscurity, forever tainted by her illegitimacy, and she has spent her life seeking vengeance against those she holds responsible for her father's humiliation and her own precarious position. But what connection does she have to Cornelius, and Sir Reginald specifically? That requires further investigation, Poirot acknowledged. However, I suspect the matter relates to an incident some 40 years past. Cornelius and Sir Reginald would have been young men at the time of Miss Lucinda's cancelled engagement. It is possible that they participated in the termination of the engagement, that they spread rumours or revealed secrets that caused the Baron to withdraw. The precise details remain obscure, but the emotional resonance is clear. The Countess has for decades planned her revenge. And what of Aunt Margot? Inspector Blackwood asked. She is equally guilty of Cornelius's murder, regardless of the Countess's manipulation. That is true, Poirot conceded. Her guilt is undeniable and must be addressed by the courts. But I suspect that when you investigate her correspondence more thoroughly, when you examine her financial records, you will discover that the Countess had been financially cultivating her for years, sending anonymous gifts, providing subtle financial assistance, gradually ingratiating herself into Aunt Margot's confidence. Aunt Margot was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, a woman of limited imagination, who was expertly manipulated into committing the crime that her manipulator desired. Inspector Blackwood's investigation proceeded with renewed purpose. Aunt Margot, confronted with evidence of her correspondence with an alias of the Countess, letters offering sympathy regarding family shame, offering assistance in resolving the Cornelius problem, ultimately conceded that she had been guided and encouraged toward Cornelius's murder by her mysterious correspondent. Yet she insisted with some validity that she could not have been aware of the Countess's true identity or ultimate intentions. I believed her to be a sympathetic soul, Aunt Margot told the examining magistrate. I believed her to be someone who understood the weight of family shame, the burden of protecting one's lineage. I was foolish, and I have paid the price for that foolishness. But murder? That was always her intention, not mine. I merely facilitated it through my own weakness and despair. A warrant was issued for the apprehension of Margot von Helstein, but the woman had, with characteristic cunning, vanished. The hospital nurse had been merely one of her identities, assumed and abandoned with the ease of changing garments. Poirot suspected that she was already en route to the continent, perhaps to Vienna or Berlin or Prague, already beginning to weave the threads of her next revenge. Despite Aunt Margot's confessions and the accumulating evidence against her, Poirot recognized that the case remained incomplete. Aunt Margot would be tried, convicted, and likely hanged. Her guilt regarding Cornelius's death was unambiguous, but the true architect of this tragedy remained at large, possibly beyond the reach of English justice. It was Timothy, in a moment of distraught clarity, who provided the final crucial piece of evidence. "My father was speaking to me," Timothy said, his voice trembling with the weight of delayed understanding. In the weeks before his death, he was troubled by something he had recalled, something from his youth that he had supposedly forgotten. He spoke of a party at Whitmore Manor some 40 years ago. He and Cornelius and several other young men had become aware that Miss Lucinda, their sister, was planning to elope with a foreign gentleman, a baron from Vienna, without parental consent. My father said that they had intervened, that they had revealed to the baron's family that Lucinda was not the virtuous, well-dowered English lady he believed her to be, but rather a young woman of questionable moral character. And what was the basis for this claim? Poirot's voice was quiet, but his attention was absolute. My father confessed that there was no such basis. It was a lie, invented by young men of considerable arrogance and privilege. Men who believed they had the right to control their sister's romantic destiny. The lie succeeded. The baron's family terminated the engagement. The baron, in despair, subsequently took his own life. And Lucinda was destroyed by the humiliation. She married beneath her station and spent her life in quiet desperation, never truly recovering from the disgrace. "And your father," said Poirot. He had forgotten this incident until recently, when something triggered his recollection. "He received a letter," said Timothy, "from the Countess, though he did not know her identity at the time. The letter simply recounted the facts of the matter, how he and Cornelius had conspired to destroy a girl's happiness out of spite and social pride, and it informed him that vengeance, though delayed, was not forgotten." Poirot processed this revelation in silence. The emotional and psychological sophistication of the Countess's revenge now became apparent. She had not sought merely to murder her enemies, but to make them comprehend before death the weight of their crimes. She had wanted them to understand that their casual cruelty, committed decades previously, had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment of infliction. That evening, Poirot requested an interview with Aunt Margot in her jail cell. She was a woman transformed by her circumstances, no longer the proud matriarch of Whitmore Manor, but rather a woman reduced to her essential components, stripped of pretense and authority. "I was wrong," she said without preamble. "I permitted myself to be guided by a dangerous woman who exploited my fears and my shame. But I was not entirely ignorant, Monsieur Poirot. I suspected, even at the time, that the woman's intentions extended beyond what she had explicitly stated. But I was weak, and I wished to believe that in facilitating Cornelius's death, I was acting in the family's interest." "Tell me," said Poirot, "what you knew of the Helstein family. What did your mysterious correspondent reveal regarding her motivations? She spoke of a great wrong committed against her father by my brother and his associates. She said that the Baron Helstein had been driven to his death by English cruelty and arrogance. She said that she had devoted her life to ensuring that those responsible would understand, before their own deaths, the magnitude of suffering they had caused." "And you believed her?" "I believed that there might be truth to her claims. I'd long suspected that Reginald harbored secrets regarding his past, indiscretions he preferred not to discuss. I was willing to accept that perhaps his younger self had been capable of profound cruelty. And I was perhaps not disinclined to believe ill of Reginald. Our relationship had always been strained. And Cornelius? Did you truly believe that his public acknowledgement of his bastard daughter would destroy the family's reputation irreparably?" "I believed what I wished to believe," said Aunt Margot bitterly. "I used her words as justification for what I had already decided to do. That is the nature of human weakness, Monsieur Poirot. We construct narratives that permit us to commit acts of which we would otherwise be ashamed." As Poirot departed from the jail, He reflected upon the psychological complexities of the case. The Countess had not merely orchestrated murders. She had orchestrated confessions, admissions, and revelations of crimes committed 4 decades previously. She had ensured that her victims would, in their final moments, comprehend the consequences of their actions. It was a revenge of extraordinary sophistication and psychological penetration. Poirot requested a final gathering of all significant parties to the case, a formal conclusion to his investigation in the manner he had perfected over decades of crime solving. Inspector Blackwood attended, along with Timothy, various household servants, and notably Dr. Hammond, whose forged prescriptions had formed the mechanism of Cornelius's murder. They assembled in the library of Whitmore Manor on a grey November afternoon. Rain pattered against the windows, and the atmosphere was suffused with a palpable sense of melancholy and unresolved tension. "Messieurs and mesdames," Poirot began, his voice carrying its characteristic blend of polite formality and intellectual authority. "We are gathered to conclude this investigation into the deaths of Mr. Cornelius Ashford and Sir Reginald Ashford. The identity of one perpetrator has been established beyond doubt. Aunt Margot Ashford, through her administration of carefully calibrated dosages of cardiac stimulants, combined with the emotional distress induced by anonymous threats, successfully precipitated Cornelius's death in such a manner as to simulate a natural cardiac failure. However," Poirot continued, beginning to pace slowly around the assembled group, "the true orchestrator of this crime was not Aunt Margot, but rather an individual who has evaded justice through meticulous planning and the exploitation of human weakness. This individual is known by various names: Countess Margot von Hellstein, among others, and is believed to be the illegitimate daughter of the late Baron Friedrich Hellstein of Vienna." Poirot paused before Dr. Hammond. "The forged prescriptions. Doctor, they were not created by Aunt Margot. The handwriting, while skillfully disguised, possessed characteristics inconsistent with her natural penmanship. It was, I believe, the Countess herself who forged your signature, having obtained samples of your handwriting through her various visits to the area. She guided Aunt Margot toward Cornelius's murder while ensuring that she herself remained distant from the actual commission of the crime. The unsigned letters threatening vengeance, these, too, were composed by the Countess. She wished to ensure that Cornelius would be gripped by psychological distress during his final days, that his fear would compound the physical effects of the poisoned tonics. She wanted him to comprehend that his death was not accident or natural consequence, but deliberate retribution. Poirot then turned his attention to Sir Reginald's death. Sir Reginald, the moment he realized the true nature of Cornelius's demise, became a threat to the Countess's carefully maintained concealment. He possessed knowledge of the Countess's personal visits to the manor. He could have identified her. Therefore, she arranged for his poisoning, employing a false identity and leaving sufficient confusion that her own involvement would remain obscured. But the Countess, Poirot concluded, made a critical error. She underestimated the resilience of the human spirit. She expected that exposure of her crimes would drive her victims to despair and suicide. Instead, they confronted their sins, acknowledged their guilt, and faced their deaths with a degree of moral clarity that she had not anticipated. In seeking to destroy the Ashford family, she has instead illuminated the possibility of redemption and moral growth. Therefore, said Poirot formally, I recommend to Inspector Blackwood that an international warrant be issued for the apprehension of Margot von Hellstein, with particular attention given to her likely movements toward Vienna or other continental cities. Her modus operandi should be circulated to law enforcement agencies across Europe, as I suspect this is not her first act of revenge. As for Aunt Margot, Poirot said with evident sadness, yet she will stand trial for Cornelius's murder. She is guilty, unambiguously so, yet she is also a victim. A woman manipulated by a more formidable criminal intelligence into committing an act that, while inexcusable, was partially orchestrated by another. I trust that the courts will weigh this complexity appropriately in their judgment. The gathering dispersed gradually, each person withdrawn into private contemplation. Only Timothy remained, looking at Poirot with a mixture of gratitude and profound sorrow. "Is there any possibility of apprehending her?" Timothy asked. "Of bringing her to justice?" "The Countess," said Poirot, "is formidable precisely because she understands the limitations of law enforcement. She will not be apprehended unless she permits herself to be apprehended. It is possible that, having achieved her revenge, she will retire from criminal activity and live out her years in continental obscurity. It is also possible that her hunger for vengeance is not yet satiated, that other victims await her attention. Only time will reveal which path she has chosen." 3 months later, the trial of Aunt Margot Ashford concluded with a verdict of guilty. However, recognizing the extenuating circumstances, her manipulation by a superior criminal intelligence, her partial motivation by concern for family honor, her advanced age, the judge imposed a sentence of life imprisonment rather than execution. It was a compromise between justice and mercy, and it was accepted by both prosecution and defense as an appropriate resolution. Cornelius's bequest to the Ashford Home for Orphan Children was confirmed as valid. The orphanage expanded significantly, opening new facilities and providing education and care to hundreds of vulnerable children. A scholarship fund was established in the name of Eleanor Thornton, Cornelius's illegitimate daughter, providing educational opportunities specifically for orphaned girls. The scandal that Aunt Margot had sought to prevent instead transformed into a source of quiet pride for the Ashford family, demonstrating that they were capable of acknowledging past wrongs and working toward restitution. Sir Reginald's estate passed to Timothy, who proved a more progressive and enlightened steward of the Ashford holdings. He established workers' benefits programs and improved conditions on the agricultural lands controlled by the family. The manor, once a seat of austere privilege, gradually became known for its progressive policies and philanthropic activities. Inspector Blackwood's investigation into the Countess, Margot von Hellstein, expanded as law. Enforcement agencies across Europe began to recognize that various seemingly unrelated deaths might be attributable to her hand. In Berlin, a prominent industrialist had died under mysterious circumstances, poisoned by a woman resembling her description. In Prague, a nobleman's heir had suffered an identical fate. The pattern suggested that her revenge was not confined to the Ashford family, but extended to numerous targets connected, however tangentially, to the humiliation of her father. An international warrant was issued, but the Countess herself was never apprehended. There were occasional reports of sightings, a woman matching her description seen in Vienna, in Constantinople, in Cairo. But these were never confirmed, and no solid evidence of her continued existence emerged after a certain point. Poirot returned to London within a month of the trial's conclusion. As he prepared to depart Whitmore Manor, Timothy embraced him with genuine gratitude. "You have restored the family's honour," Timothy said, while simultaneously ensuring that the true perpetrator's motives were comprehended. "That is a delicate balance, and you achieved it with remarkable grace." "I did not restore honour," Poirot replied gently. and I merely illuminated the path by which others might restore it themselves. Your father, before his death, achieved a measure of moral clarity. Cornelius, in his final weeks, acted upon conscience. These are triumphs of the human spirit, not achievements of detective reasoning. I was merely the instrument through which their redemption became possible. The motorcar conveyed Poirot back to Ashford Station, where he boarded the southbound train. As the vehicle departed, he settled into his compartment with the satisfied air of a man who had accomplished his appointed task with precision and integrity. The case of the Whitmore inheritance, as it came to be known in Scotland Yard archives, was closed, yet somewhere on the continent there remained an unresolved element. A woman of extraordinary intelligence and implacable will, moving through the shadows of European society, her motives obscure and her ultimate fate unknowable. Whether she continued her revenge, or whether she had achieved sufficient satisfaction and retired from her dark vocation, remained a question that Poirot could not answer with certainty. 2 years later, Poirot received a letter forwarded by his London office. It had no return address, and the handwriting was carefully disguised, employing the same block capitals that had characterized the earlier threatening letters in the case. The message was brief and elegant in its simplicity. Monsieur Poirot, you have proven yourself to possess a mind of sufficient acuity to appreciate the artistry of careful planning and precise execution. I do not ask for your forgiveness, for I require none. I do not fear your apprehension, for I remain beyond the reach of ordinary law enforcement. But I wished you to understand that your intervention in the Ashford matter, while it thwarted my immediate intentions, did not diminish the essential purpose of my actions. The Ashfords now comprehend the consequences of their cruelty. They have been forced to confront the sins of their past. That was my objective, and that objective has been achieved. I am content. Therefore, I inform you that my campaign of vengeance is concluded. My father's honour has been sufficiently avenged. The Ashford family may now proceed with their lives, knowing that justice, however unorthodox in its delivery, has been served. Should we meet again, Monsieur Poirot, I trust we shall conduct ourselves as equals in intellect, if not in morality. Farewell, M.H. Poirot regarded this letter for a considerable time, his expression suggesting neither satisfaction nor dissatisfaction, but rather a profound acknowledgement of complexity. He placed the letter within his private files, appropriately indexed under cases not concluded through conventional means. In the years that followed, no further reports emerged of suspicious deaths matching the Countess's known methodology. Whether she had retired to a quiet life of obscurity, whether she had relocated to some distant corner of the world, or whether she had succeeded in a final act of self-erasure, Poirot could not determine. The mystery remained eternally incomplete, a testament to the profound gap that sometimes exists between justice and the resolution of crime. Whitmore Manor continued its gradual transformation, from a seat of privileged austere tradition into an institution of progressive enlightenment. Timothy married and raised a family there, and his children grew up in an environment informed by the hard-won wisdom of their ancestors' confrontation with guilt and redemption. The Manor's library, where so much of the investigation had culminated, became a place of study and contemplation rather than shadowed secrets. The Ashford Home for Orphan Children thrived and expanded, providing refuge and education to hundreds of vulnerable young people. In a quiet corner of the institution's grounds, a memorial tablet was placed, bearing the names of Eleanor Thornton and her mother, Sarah Blackwell, and commemorating Cornelius Ashford's final act of moral courage in providing for their legacy. As for Poirot himself, He reflected occasionally upon the case when quieter evenings permitted philosophical meditation. He recognized in the Countess a worthy adversary, an intelligence of considerable brilliance, corrupted by a justifiable desire for revenge, a person who had allowed herself to be defined and limited by others' cruelty, who had sought redemption through further cruelty, and who had ultimately discovered that no amount of revenge could truly restore what had been destroyed. It was a meditation upon human nature that occupied some corner of Poirot's consciousness for the remainder of his days. The recognition that even the most perfectly orchestrated revenge, the most intellectually satisfying destruction of enemies, ultimately proved hollow and incomplete. True justice required not merely the punishment of wrongdoers, but the transformation of human hearts, the acknowledgement of guilt, and the possibility of redemption. The little Belgian detective, with his magnificent moustache and his orderly mind, had learned once again what he had learned 1,000 times before, that the resolution of crime was often less about the identification of perpetrators than about the restoration of moral order in a world fundamentally disinclined toward order of any variety. And as he sat in his London apartment on quiet November evenings, Poirot would sometimes recall Whitmore Manor and the moorlands of Yorkshire, and he would allow himself a small, satisfied smile, knowing that his work had contributed, however minimally, to the triumph of human redemption over human vengeance. Thus concluded the matter of the Whitmore inheritance, a case that, while brought to formal legal resolution, remained forever incomplete in the deeper philosophical sense, a reminder that some mysteries possess multiple layers of truth, and that justice itself is sometimes a far more complex and uncertain concept than the law alone can encompass.